Harrison Ford went completely, utterly silent. Not at the end of what he was saying, not after a pause, mid-sentence, as if language had simply evacuated. The sound coming through the studio speakers lasted less than a minute, a piano melody, and then a woman's voice, and then 12 words. And by the time those 12 words finished, Harrison Ford was sitting in the chair across from Jimmy Fallon, and he was not going to speak. Jimmy tried twice. He tried a third time. 300 people sat completely still and watched one of the most controlled men in Hollywood stare at a fixed point past the cameras and make no sound at all. It lasted nearly a minute. It felt considerably longer. It was an evening in early 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon was taping at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and Harrison Ford, 81 years old, unhurried, carrying himself like a man who has already decided how much he intends to give, had agreed to appear and discuss his latest work. The audience that night ran several generations deep, people who had been children when Star Wars opened in 1977 and built whole interior lives around who Harrison Ford was. Younger people who came up with a different version of the same icon. All of them had dressed for the occasion. When he walked out, the applause came the way it does for certain people. Not enthusiasm exactly, but acknowledgement. Like the room confirming something. The interview was going well. Harrison was measured, dry, precisely as funny as he wanted to be, and no funnier. The segment producer, who had worked in television for 21 years, later said she had no explanation for what came next. Jimmy had been handed a small, sealed envelope by one of the show's producers just before the segment began. He had been told only to open it and play what was inside when the conversation reached the right moment. When that moment came, he opened it and removed a small digital audio player with a single file loaded onto its screen. No title, no other information. He told Harrison he had something he needed to hear. He said it the way you say something when you are not entirely certain what you are about to do, but you are certain it needs to be done. Not polished, not rehearsed, just a sound. He pressed play. What came through the overhead studio speakers first was a piano melody. Simple, quiet, unhurried, recorded in what was clearly a living room on a small device. The ambient sounds of the house faintly present underneath it. The notes slightly imperfect in the way that private recordings always are. The melody lasted a little under 30 seconds. And then a woman's voice came through, warm and certain, speaking directly, as though she had already thought carefully about the exact words she wanted to say. She said 12 words. Harrison Ford's expression changed on the fourth word. By the 12th, he had left the room in every meaningful sense, and only his body remained. Jimmy did not move. The entire studio froze. Jimmy said his name once. Then again. Harrison wasn't looking at him. He was looking somewhere past the set and the cameras and the fluorescent brightness of the studio, somewhere in the direction of 54 years ago. People in the front rows didn't breathe. Questlove's drumsticks hung suspended mid-motion. The director did not cut to commercial. 300 people held their breath. 30 seconds passed. Then 40. Jimmy leaned forward and said his name one more time, quietly, not as a host managing a segment, just as one person checking on another. Harrison blinked. He looked at Jimmy. He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked away from the cameras. He pressed 2 fingers against his lips for a moment. His voice was barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone. That's Eleanor. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1969. Harrison Ford wasn't always Harrison Ford, the icon. In the fall of 1969, Harrison Ford was 27 years old and working as a carpenter in Los Angeles. He had been doing small television parts for 4 years. Bit roles, nothing going anywhere, and had taken up carpentry to keep his family steady while he kept trying. He had not quit on acting. He had not made peace with the possibility of quitting. He existed in the particular suspension of a person who has not yet found out which way it is going to go. That was the version of Harrison Ford, who arrived at Eleanor Marsh's house in Studio City on a Monday morning in October. Eleanor was 42 years old and gave private piano lessons out of her home. She was not a famous musician. She was not connected to anyone in the film industry. She was a woman who had spent 20 years teaching other people's children to play piano and who played for herself in the evenings because it was the only part of the day that was entirely hers. She had a direct manner and a low tolerance for deflection. Harrison had come to repair her bookshelves and a damaged door frame. The job was supposed to take 2 days. It took 4. On the first morning, Eleanor sat at the upright piano in her living room and played while he worked. Not for him. She had simply decided to keep doing what she always did when someone else was in the house. The melody she played was her own, something she had been trying to finish for years, quiet and circular, and slightly unresolved at the end. Harrison set his tools down at one point and just listened. She noticed. She kept playing. When she finished, he said it was good. She said, "It's unfinished. 10 years and I still can't get past the same 3 bars. He said, "Maybe those 3 bars are already what they're supposed to be." She looked up from the piano and looked at him the way people look at you when you have said something that cost them something to hear. They talked a great deal over those 4 days. Eleanor asked real questions and expected real answers. She found out about the acting, about 4 years of small roles and missed calls, and the kind of patience that isn't really patience because it has no peace in it. She said, once, without looking up from the keys, people who carry their purpose quietly are always the last to be believed. That's not a reason to stop carrying it. On the last morning, before Harrison loaded his tools into his truck, Eleanor made a recording. She used the small cassette player she kept beside the piano. She sat down and played the melody again, the full thing, including the 3 bars she had never managed to resolve. Before she played, she spoke briefly into the device. She said 12 words. "This one is for the ones who know what they came here to do." She gave him the tape. She said, "Play it when you forget what you are." He played it 3 times on the drive home. But the years move in only one direction. Star Wars happened in 1977. And then everything happened. The kind of everything that fills every drawer and every year, and eventually fills even the spaces where smaller things used to live. The tape went into a box. The box went into storage. Harrison Ford became impossible to have known as anything smaller than what he had become. Eleanor Marsh gave piano lessons in Studio City for 30 more years. She retired in 2000. She watched Star Wars in a theater near her home in May of 1977, alone, and came home and wrote a letter, care of a production company address she had found in a magazine, that she sealed and never sent. In a conversation with her granddaughter years later, she said simply, "I want him to feel like a person, not a moment. If he ever comes to know about this, I don't want him to feel like a story." She died in the spring of 2022, at the age of 94. Her granddaughter, a woman named Sarah, was sorting through Eleanor's belongings when she found the letter and, in the same drawer, a second cassette tape, the original recording, kept when Eleanor had made a copy for Harrison all those years ago. The label read, in faded ink, "For HF, when you forget." Sarah spent months finding a way through to someone at Harrison Ford's office. When she finally reached someone, she said only, My grandmother kept something of his for 53 years. I think you should know it exists." The Tonight Show staff had been told only that a guest requiring aisle seating would be in the audience. They did not know what was on the recording. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Harrison Ford had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. 3 days before the taping, his office had quietly contacted the show. He had spoken with Sarah by phone and agreed to have the recording played live in front of an audience, with no preview and no preparation of any kind. He had not told Jimmy what the recording was. He had not briefed the segment team on what was about to be played. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Harrison Ford set down the glass he had been holding. He looked at Jimmy. He said something that wasn't entirely a question and wasn't entirely a statement. "Is she here?" Jimmy nodded once. Harrison looked out into the audience, 300 people in absolute silence, and his eyes moved across the rows slowly, methodically, the way a person searches for something they had given up expecting to find. Near the far end of the center aisle, a woman in her late 30s was already on her feet. She was not performing anything. She was simply standing. The way you stand when you have been carrying something for a long time and you can finally see where it belongs. Harrison exhaled once, slowly. Then he stood up. Jimmy Fallon climbed over his desk. He didn't go around it. Over it. One hand flat on the surface, both legs clearing the edge without hesitation. He stopped at the front of the stage and looked out at 300 people in complete, unbroken silence. His voice, when he found it, was not entirely steady. "Folks," he said, "I think we need to let this happen." Harrison was already moving. He walked down from the stage without a word, without looking at the cameras. He walked the full length of the center aisle to where Sarah stood, and he stopped. She was holding an envelope. Old, slightly yellowed at the corners. Addressed in Eleanor's handwriting to a production company address that had not existed for decades. Sealed. Never opened by anyone other than the woman who had closed it. Harrison looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. "She kept it," he said. His voice barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone. "She kept everything," Sarah said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed something he had been carrying there all evening. A small cassette tape, faded and slightly yellowed, the handwritten label still legible for HF, when you forget. He had found it 3 weeks earlier in a storage box he hadn't opened in 30 years. Sarah looked at the tape. Then she looked at him. "She had the original," she said quietly. "She made a copy to give you and kept the original. I found them both in the same drawer." He closed his eyes. "What did the letter say?" he asked. Sarah reached into her bag and produced a folded piece of paper, a transcription she had made by hand, so the original envelope could remain sealed. She read it quietly, just for him, while the audience waited without a sound. The letter was not long. It was precise and direct, written in the voice of a woman who had never needed much decoration for what she meant. When Sarah finished, Harrison stood in the center aisle of The Tonight Show and said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the tape in his hand. "I never found a way to thank her," he said. "She didn't need it," Sarah said. "She wrote that. She said watching was enough. She said it was always more than enough." He was not Harrison Ford at that moment. He was 27 years old, sitting on a living room floor in Studio City, and a woman at an upright piano was telling him that carrying something quietly was not the same as carrying it wrong. Jimmy Fallon stood 8 feet away with both hands pressed flat over his mouth. Questlove stood up from behind his drum kit. The ovation began somewhere in the middle of the room and moved outward through the studio like a wave until it was the entire room at once. The director did not cut to commercial. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 19 minutes after the cameras stopped, Harrison Ford sat in the green room with the cassette tape and Sarah's handwritten transcription on the table in front of him. She had given him both to keep. He had said very little once the show ended. He had shaken her hand and held it for a moment longer than the moment required. The following year, he recorded a complete account of the original conversations from the fall of 1969, drawn entirely from his own memory, narrated without notes, and donated it to an oral history archive, so that Eleanor Marsh's name would exist somewhere that would last. The cassette tape is in his home in Wyoming now. He has not played it again. He said, in a short interview several months later, that he does not need to. He said he can hear it clearly without pressing play. Some recordings finish their work the first time they are heard.